everybody, it's Savannah again, and this time I'm totally blaming this video series on me and Summer's best friend. Last year she introduced us to the Hannibal TV series, or better known as Bryan Hannibal, and like many others I think we became instantly obsessed. And usually like modern, I'll say modern because it premiered in 2013, but modern clothes don't usually get us too excited, but every time Hannibal came on screen I was like, oh, kind of like that suit. Like, ooh, that's a nice suit. And then finally I saw, most people probably know what suit I'm talking about, but the Hannibal suit in season 2. He only wears it a couple of times, but it's this gray with a really bright red bold window pane. And I was like, I've got to have that suit. So obviously from this channel you know that we sew, but tailoring is kind of like a whole different animal, and I had looked into some of it before, but never really tried too much. So Summer and I started kind of looking at different, I don't know, Pinterest, YouTube, but nothing was really giving us too much like detailed information. So we bought a textbook. Let's see if I can get it close enough. Classic Tailoring Techniques for Menswear, a Construction Guide by Dennis Antoine, I think, and Robert Cabrera. I'm not like a master at pronunciation or anything. And this was just a used textbook, but so far this has been the best thing. Obviously it's menswear, so we had to kind of adapt for us since we are in fact women. And that was another thing I was going to mention for this series. I'm sorry to all of you purists out there, but for obvious reasons like not being a man or 6 foot tall, we are going to have to make a few changes. Not just because of that, but also because the fabric is no longer available for that suit. So we chose the best that we could, and I'm going to keep saying we because Summer, my sister, is also making her version of a Hannibal suit, which is going to be the Raven Stag Hannibal that is on the stand in season 2. So wish us luck. We're going to start with the vest because that is the smallest garment, so if we mess up, you're not wasting that much fabric. I have plenty of fabric, but Summer does not, so we have to be careful. Alright. Oh, and I'm going to say to any tailors that happen to find this video, I'm sorry in advance for any blasphemous things that we're going to do, but everybody starts somewhere, right?
So these are the fabrics that I ended up choosing for my suit. The lining is a silver and red polyester jacquard. And then the fashion fabric is a Donegal tweed, which is made up of some like creams, blacks, and then the reds. And I know that Hannibal doesn't really wear tweed, but this is the fabric that kept standing out to me when I was doing my search. It was surprisingly difficult to find a red window pane that was that bold and that large of a repeat. Of course, I bought my fabric before we bought the tailoring book, and the tailoring book actually said to not start out as a beginner with tweeds, but here I go, choosing the hardest thing to do first. So here's a small lineup of most of the mock-ups that we made for the vest. We decided we didn't want to do the straight across just because it kind of cut us off at an awkward place. We're both very short-waisted, so we thought that the points kind of added a little bit of extra length without actually bringing the full length of the vest down. The main thing to note is that we kept starting with the pattern with our waist size instead of our bust size, so the bust size kept coming out too big. So we actually did a duct tape mock-up and then made a pattern for that, which is the white and the green mock-up that you can see on here. So that's all I'll say. Just it's going to be, if you are going to make this for yourself, it's going to just be a matter of you fitting it to your body. I can't commentate too much on that specifically for everyone. So to get started cutting out the vest, I took a pattern that was the net only and aligned the center front line in between 2 vertical rows of the window pane. After getting that secured in place, I then took a marker and made a bunch of register marks where all the stripes were. I then carefully thread marked the entirety of the outline of the vest, as well as any darts and placement marks like buttons or the welt pockets. This is because the chalk didn't really draw well on my fabric. It also had the added advantage of having the marks on both sides of the fabric. So here's all the fabric cut out, the fashion fabric, the lining, and the interfacing for the front of the vest. In order to prepare the interfacing, I went ahead and put all of the darts and the welt pocket markings on it, as well as the center front line and the buttonholes. Please note that I made all these markings on the side of the interfacing that does not have the glue dots on it. This is in fact a fusible interfacing, so in order to attach it to the fashion fabric, I had to use a damp cover cloth and hold the iron down on top of it for 10 seconds for each section until the whole piece was covered and fused. Now it was time to actually start constructing the vest. I started by pressing the darts down their center lines so that it would be easier to pin them and sew them. To sew the darts, you start at the wide end of the dart, you backstitch, and then you work your way all the way to the front end of the dart where the tip is. And at the tip, you don't actually backstitch, you run as close as you can to the edge of the fabric until you fall off, and then you tie it off by hand. That way it doesn't make an ugly dimple at the tip of your dart. Once all the darts were sewed up, I carefully split open each dart until it got close to the end, and then slashed to where I could press each of the darts open. For the end of the dart, you actually take a large needle with some thread strung through and press over it. That big needle keeps the tip of the dart from going to one side or the other. That was a trick that was in the book. Another thing that they stressed in the book often was to never directly iron on your fashion fabric on the right side. You always want to cover it with a cover cloth so that you don't accidentally singe your fabric. This was a hard thing to remember. I think I missed a few, but that's okay. Before starting on the welt pockets, I ended up doing several practices just to make sure that I wouldn't mess up my actual vest. The top left pocket is the method that I ended up going with, which I will show you in a second. So I decided to try out doing the welt pocket before filming it, and I think it turned out pretty well. I have it basted together so I can't really show you the underside. Try not to totally shadow this. Here, let me unpin this. This mannequin is not to my measurements or anything. I just have it pinned to one of the mock-up vests, but there she is. I probably have more facing than I should under there, but whatever. I wasn't going to cut it after I already sewed the lining part on, so because I was lazy. But I think it turned out actually nice and smooth. Maybe if I zoom in, it won't shadow it. We'll see if it gapes after I undo the basting thread. You're supposed to leave the basting thread in until after it's fully constructed, so it doesn't get like stretched out and stuff when the rest of the vest is being made. So I'm going to film the other one, show you how I did it. Hopefully we will get twins and not sister pockets. So in order to get started on the welt pocket, I had to kind of redraw the box because I changed up the method that I was going to use. I still used the same starting points, but I decided to make the opening only a 1/2 inch and not 5/8. Also, the tailoring book gave a tip that you need to actually draw the lines on your box for the welt slightly downwards in a curve, but no greater than 1/8 of an inch or else it will be noticeable. This is to help keep the welt from gaping open when it's being worn. Using pins to indicate where my welt box was positioned on the right side of the fabric, I took another small piece of the fashion fabric and carefully lined up the first stripe of the window pane that was closest to the center front. The other one can't match up because there was a dart in the vest, so we only worry about that front one. And this is me just pinning on some interfacing there's a 1/2 inch welt and then a 1/4 inch of seam allowance, and I'm just going to press that so that it fuses with the fashion fabric on the wrong side of the fabric. Also take note that I aligned the top of the welt interfacing with the top of the stripe. That's because on his original vest, the stripes are actually what the welt is positioned onto. They kind of make like a little red bar where there isn't one in the design, almost to purposely make the welt stand out. I trimmed off the excess fabric from the welt, leaving only the small 1/4 inch seam allowance. I then carefully lined up the stitch line on the interfacing welt with the stitch line on the welt box. And you can see here how I'm kind of lining it up both back and front, trying to make sure that they match. The pins really help in this instance. You can also see that I thread marked it, but it's not so easy to see when you have your welt piece over it. And this is kind of a trial and error thing. You kind of just have to keep going over and over until you actually get it right. So I actually don't backstitch when I do this, because if I have to undo it, it's a lot easier. And also you can take a hand needle if you don't quite make it to the correct parts and stitch that with just the little bits of the tails that you leave. So movie magic, this does not turn out the first time. I actually had to redo this welt stitch line like 3 times before I got it right. So here you can see that the stitch line and the drawn line of the bottom of the box match up perfectly. And then I'm just going to go ahead and pull those through the little tails and tie them off. So here's the welt attached to the right side of the garment. Now I need to construct the back facing for the pocket, and this piece is almost like a mirror image of the welt piece, and it's designed to where the 1/4 inch seam allowance disappears and then there's just that red stripe, so it mimics the same as the welt, and that way it makes it less noticeable if the pocket does gape. Now this part is probably against what a tailor would actually do, but I like to use the back to actually sew this on because you can see where the stitch line is supposed to be. And I do that the same as I did the welt part of the pocket. You just sew it without back stitching, and then you can tie it off if it looks good from the front as well as the back. So there's the facing, and then this is the welt that will be flipped up when it's finished. So here's the scary part of making a welt pocket. Once you get the facing and the welt attached, you need to go ahead and slash open your opening of the pocket. And you kind of stop about a 1/2 inch away from the end, and you do little triangles at the ends so that you can, when it's flipped open, you can fold that little triangle back. And this needs to be very precise. It needs to go right to that corner. It doesn't need to go past it, and it doesn't need to fall short. So now that the pocket is slashed open, you can fold back both the facing and the welt. I went ahead and pressed both of the seams open so that there was a crisp line. It also reduces bulk. So here you can see the little triangles being pushed back, and we're going to secure those later, but first you actually have to do a hand stitch in between the stitch line of the bottom of the welt, and you only need to catch the back of the welt pocket fabric, not the whole pocket, or else you would inadvertently close the pocket back up. And here I am just using a larger back stitch in the ditch of this seam line, and I'm only catching the welt fabric to the back, and this also gives a secure point for the lining of the pocket to be attached to. So here it is with the welt technically completed. Now it's time to secure both ends of the welt and start making this pocket a real thing. So I'm going to carefully pin down each one of those little triangles, and then using the zipper foot on my machine, I'm going to stitch literally right at the beginning and the end of that triangle. So here it goes. You just stitch down literally at the end and the beginning of the triangle, and you can use a back stitch. and you do have to be quite careful that everything else is lying neatly underneath before you stitch it down. So here's the welt pocket after I get that part done. To be honest, I was a little bit dubious that this one was not going to gape. I decided to go ahead and press it before continuing onward. So here it is again after more pressing, and it looks a little bit better. But before beginning to put the actual lining in the pockets, I went ahead and whip stitched the opening closed. So this is me just prepping the back for the lining pieces for the pocket. I kind of cleaned up the threads, pinked the ends of the tweed so that it wouldn't, fray too much. Even though it's on the inside, it can still fray. And then I just cut out some rectangles of the lining for the rest of the pocket and sewed them on with like a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So I finished the top facing one, and now this is going to be attached to the leftovers of the welt fabric. And it's just sewed the same as the first one. So here's both lining pieces attached, and I just went ahead and pressed them down. And then everything was much too long, which I didn't make a specific size, so I just kind of cut it away, trying to get it short enough to avoid the seam allowances of the actual vest. And then I pinned around the whole pocket and then took it to the machine to get sewed. And you kind of do this with the pocket down and the vest part up. And you just start at the bottom of the welt and work your way around. The seam allowances are kind of uneven. You actually trim that off later so that the seams are graded. It is. Both pieces have their pockets. So there's the first one, the second one, and then finally the breast pocket. And it looks like it's lining up and everything really good right now. And it was the same method that I used for the other ones. Just I had to spend way more time trying to figure out like how to match this up. And it looks like it's, sitting in there really good right now, but everything's basted, so we'll see when we finally take it out how well it actually sits. But now I can get to basic construction. Guess next is the collar pieces. Then I can finally put it together and I'll have my first actual piece of the suit finished. So here are my collar pieces, one piece of lining and one piece of the fashion fabric. So I went to sew everything at the 5/8 inch seam allowance. However, I quickly learned that I should have put the tweed underneath, like on the feed dogs, instead of on the top because it has a tendency to stretch. So the second piece I did the lining up. Instead of doing what you would normally do on a collar piece like this, I did not cut a bunch of little triangles out to reduce the bulk in the seams. Instead, I trimmed the seams down to about 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch and graded them to help reduce the bulk. Then when I pressed these collar pieces, I also tried to ensure that the lining part stayed underneath. That way when viewed from the top, you wouldn't see any of it peeking out. So if you look at the reference pictures for this suit, you will see that they have it's either called pick stitching or prick stitching, I've seen it both ways, along all the edges. And this is kind of like a decorative stitch as well as a functional stitch. It is used to keep all of the lines of the suit crisp, and I'm just taking some thread and running it through some beeswax and a piece of paper to kind of melt that beeswax, and that just gives the thread more body. Here we go. This is a pick stitch. It's kind of like a back stitch, but you only catch a little bit of the back fabric. And you want to try to make these as similar in size and equally distant as you possibly can. But they don't have to be perfect. It's kind of a characteristic of a handmade bespoke suit. So after the collar pieces were finished, I moved on to the lining. They are just basic construction, and I made the darts the same as I did on the front pieces, except I did not slash them open. The fabric is thin enough to where I could just iron them to one side or the other. And I ironed them in different directions so that they would not lay on top of each other. The cinch straps are made of rectangular pieces of fabric that I just sewed into tubes. I had to do a 3/4 inch seam allowance because my straps ended up being a little bit too wide. Once they were sewed, I tried to press them open without actually putting creases into the sides. I used the knitting needle for this just to kind of help hold it open without crushing it. And then after I pressed those open, I went ahead and trimmed the seam allowances down so that they would fit into the strap. And then I just sewed the end right here with a seam down the middle so that the straps would only have a seam on the inside and not be seen on either edge. And then I just carefully flip this right side out using my fingers and then a knitting needle to help it along the rest of the way. To position the straps on the back lining, I just kind of eyeballed where the waist was in the back and then used a ruler to double check that both straps were at the same height. I was also careful to position the straps with enough overlap so that when they went through the little slide buckle that they would still have enough to grab onto. Now on Hannibal's vest, the straps are actually secured down at each of the darts, so I went ahead and put some pins to hold those in place and double check that they were the same height as well. And then I just used a regular stitch to base all these down. I didn't use a back stitch on the parts by the darts, that way I could pull the little thread tails on the inside and tie them off. So here's the back lining all finished. I did end up whip stitching the straps together just so that they wouldn't get accidentally sewed down when I did the rest of the construction. So here's essentially the entire vest all laid out. You'll see the fashion fronts with the outer back, and then the lining fronts and the lining inside of the back. And I decided to not make facings for this just because the tweed is quite thick, and basically this whole construction is all about reducing bulk with that fabric. And I'm just going to do like the collar pieces where I'm going to make sure that all the lining stays underneath so it doesn't peek out. I then pinned and sewed the shoulder seams on both the lining and the outer fashion fabrics. Then once I put the shoulder pieces together, I then laid the lining fabric and the fashion fabrics together with the right sides together. And then I pinned around all along the front outer edge and the neckline, along both armholes and the bottom, leaving the side seams open. After that, it was just a matter of sewing around all those edges, trying my best to follow along the stitch lines that I had marked on my inner facing. Then it was the arduous task of cutting all around the corners and grading all the seam allowances, and then also slashing the seams like around the armholes so that they could be freed up when they were turned right side out. When grading the seams, I chose to leave the fabric that was closest to the fashion fabric as the longest, and then trimming the stuff closer that was further away. So in this case, it was the interfacing that was left the longest, and then the other layers of fabric were sequentially cut down. Also note, whenever I slash these seam allowances, I kind of offset them to where all the slashes wouldn't be in the same spot. That way, when it was stretched open, there wouldn't be like hard slash lines visible from the outside. Basically, there would be indents if you did them all in the same line. Then after all the interior prep work, it was finally time to turn this thing right side out. I did use a knitting needle to kind of push the corners out that were kind of stuck. You do need to be careful when doing this because it is a thin area as far as the seam allowance goes. Now, in order to get the side seams sewed together, you kind of have to sew this in kind of like a round. So the first thing I do is I carefully match up those seam allowances on the top and the bottom of the vest. They need to be really in line or else it won't look right when it's flipped right side out. Then I just finished pinning as much as I could. You're going to have to leave a hole in order to finish this off, so you just sew the most that you can and hopefully not catch anything. It's kind of hard to explain, so hopefully the visuals will help. Then after the side seams were sewed, I went ahead and gave the whole vest a nice press. You can see here that I'm trying to keep all of the lining on the inside of the fashion fabric. After pressing the inside, I went ahead and pressed the entire outside, using a press cloth whenever I was working over the wool. After the pressing, I then carefully pinned the side seam openings together on the inside lining and slip stitched them closed, trying my best to make this as invisible as possible. Now it was finally time to do some of those finishing details. I first started by putting the slide buckle on the cinch straps. I then also pick stitched around any of the edges that had the wool on them. And that includes right here underneath the collar. It was essential for keeping the collar folded down. Here's a comparison shot of one side being pick stitched and one side not being pick stitched. Can you tell which one it is? Essentially, all that was left to do now was to put the buttons and the buttonholes in the vest. Since this fabric was hard to mark with any chalk, I decided to just use thread marking as my guide for the buttonholes. You can see me pulling it out as I go along. Then it was time for all the buttons. Setting the buttons in the correct position was the most important because it would essentially help line up all of the window pane. If you didn't put the buttons in the right spot, it just wouldn't line up correctly. I was so excited to remove all of the basting threads and finally see how this vest looked finished. If you've lasted this far, thank you so much for watching. I know it didn't turn out exactly like Hannibal's original vest, but I think it was a very good first attempt, and I'm pretty darn happy with it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Until next time with the pants.